Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diasporas rede.
Falando.
Diasporas
Govori. De parler.
Diasporas spreekt.
Diasporas Speaking.
Prishtina. My name is Rina Limoni, and I'm the host of Diasporas Speaking. In this episode, we'll be joined by Hana Marku, an immigration and refugee lawyer based in Toronto, Canada. Together, we'll explore the legal challenges women face when seeking refuge or migrating. Welcome to Diasporas Speaking, Hana. It is a pleasure to have you here today.
I'm really happy to be here, Rina.
As perhaps you might have come across by now, we usually start the conversation with these questions. Where are you from in Kosovo, and where did you grow up?
I was born in Prishtina in Kosovo, and that is where I spent the first, I want to say, 4 to 5 years of my life. I lived with my parents and my grandmother in a neighborhood called Prishtina. And this was in the late 80s, early 90s. My childhood was very idyllic up until the breakdown of Yugoslavia, which we all, meaning everyone from our generation, witnessed that, Yugoslavia falling apart. And my parents saw what was coming. They knew, most people of their generation knew, that war would eventually reach them as well. And that was the motivation for them to immigrate. They went to the United States, and initially they left me behind. They left me with my grandparents in Macedonia while they went to the United States to try to get immigration status, to try to find work, and to try to get permission to stay in the US. Eventually, I was able to join them. I was able to join them just in time for kindergarten. And for me, the early days of kindergarten were, in hindsight, hilarious because I couldn't speak a word of English. I was just happy to be with my parents. I didn't really care that I had to go to school, and I hated kindergarten. And in the early days of kindergarten, I know that my teachers would call my parents and tell them, Hana is crying again. She's asking for someone named Bobby. Who's Bobby? And of course, the person who I was calling for was my father. I was calling for Bobby, and I had no idea how to express that to my teachers. So for a while, they thought that I was deeply attached to somebody named Bobby. Those are my earliest memories, actually, of being an immigrant. If I had to pinpoint my first immigrant memory, that would be it, hands down. We eventually moved again. We moved to Canada from the United States. And there were 2 reasons for doing that. And the primary reason was that it was possible to become citizens faster in Canada than in the United States. And I think for my parents, it was very important to have a sense of permanent status somewhere. And in Canada, the pathway to becoming a citizen is more straightforward. It's more direct. At least at the time it was. And we also had an aunt in Canada, whereas in the United States, we really had no one. So we immigrated again to Canada in 1993. That is where my sister was born. For me, at that point, change had become very normal. I had already moved from living with my parents to living with my grandparents, then had moved to the United States. So the thought of moving again to this place called Canada, it wasn't so frightening at that point. I learned to adapt very quickly to all of the new environments that I was put into. What ended up happening to me during this period of transition and moving was there was so much pressure to learn English as fast as possible that during those years, I lost pretty much all of my Albanian. And that was very concerning to my parents, especially my mother. And anyone in the diaspora knows that keeping the language is the most important thing that a diaspora kid is supposed to do. It is possibly even more important than marrying an Albanian, possibly. What am I saying? No, actually marrying an Albanian is probably high up there, just as important at speaking Albanian. But the point is that I lost my Albanian during those years. And when the war broke out in 1999, I really didn't understand the political context for the war. What I knew was my grandmother, my aunt, and my cousins, they were all still in Prishtina, and I knew that where they were, it was very dangerous. I knew that there were soldiers there. I knew that it was dangerous to be Albanian. I knew that they were at risk of having something really bad happen to them. And for my parents, I think that time was miserable, terrifying, frightening. And we moved back in the summer of 1999, basically right after the NATO intervention. I suspect the motivation for that move was really just that exhilarating feeling of it's finally over. And that was my first exposure to Kosova as well. I was still quite young. I was about 12 or 13, but I was able to think and able to understand politically, at least a little bit. Those years for me were really about relearning the language and re-meeting my family members because it had been a span of years where I really wasn't a part of their day to day lives. And that is the period of time when I actually learned what they had experienced in the war. Those stories are etched in my memory. Not obviously the experience of being put on a train, being sent to a refugee camp. I don't have those memories, but the memory of being told about it is etched in my memory. In 2004, at that point, my parents decided to send me back to Canada so that I could finish high school in Canada. So they were thinking ahead to my university education, and they thought that the transition to university would be easier for me if I at least completed my last year of high school in Canada. Eventually, my parents also decided to move back. I did my BA and then I did an MA. I got a public service job after the end of my master's. I was not a very good public servant. I definitely did the government of Ontario and its citizens a service by dropping out of the public service. The big thing that changed for me in those, I guess we could call them the mid 2000s or close to the 2000 aughts, Kosovo became independent. And at that point, I had been writing blogs for a magazine and website called Kosovo 2.0. I was so excited to be a part of this project, to be a part of this new vision of this new country that could completely reinvent itself. I had a real sense of longing to go back, partially out of a sense of excitement and the unpredictability of what this new republic would look like. That was a strong motivation for me to come back. When I came back to Kosovo, it was in 2012. And at this point, I'm in my mid 20s. I'm a fully formed adult, but I don't think I would say that I had a real political education until I went back to Kosovo as an adult. And the reason why I say that is because that period of time for me was the period of time when I became introduced to the feminist movement in Kosovo, the LGBTQ rights movement. I came face to face with the ugly parts of our society, specifically around sexism, misogyny, classism, and also racism. I came face to face with it in a way that had been either theoretical or brushed aside because when you live abroad, the impetus is to brush away the parts of your culture that are not so pretty and not so easy to deal with.
No
And
longer
it's a
fantasized in a way.
precisely, and it is a very different, it's a very different conversation when you are part of a society. And so I mentioned I came back to Canada. I came back to Canada to get a law degree. I had been a writer and a researcher in Kosovo for about 4 years. And I had the idea that getting a law degree would give me a little bit of leverage in the world, a little bit of leverage to not just observe things and write about them, but maybe materially change things in a small way as well. So I've been back in Canada since 2016. I went back to school and got my law degree. And now I practice refugee and immigration law in Canada. And I'm very happy to talk about how refugee law intersects with the experiences of women and what can we draw from those conversations as Albanians.
You have a very unique migration journey. Your journey, and I was not aware to this extent of it, is moving back and forth. Why did you move back to Canada? What triggered this move? Was the law degree or going back to university the only reason you wanted to go back?
I think I had reached my fill of being a writer and researcher, frankly, not just because the money is not great, but also because Kosova, and this is true of every place, but I think especially in a place that is still young, right, in terms of this current republic of Kosovo, young in that sense, it's a site of struggle. It's a site of constant struggle between what vision of the future is going to prevail. Will it be a vision of the future in which the same great men continue to have a chokehold on power and maintain the same power relations because it suits their purposes? Or is this a place that is going to serve the interests of everyone who lives there? And that includes people who currently are at the bottom of the power pyramid. That side of struggle can be really painful. It can be very painful. I found it very painful to be at this site of struggle. And what was I doing? Well, I was writing about it, I suppose. I feel like my job was like a professional commentator sometimes. I also did research, some of which got published. And I don't belittle those contributions at all. I'm happy that I did them. But I guess in my mind, I thought that getting a law degree would mean that I could do more than just observe and write and detail what I was seeing. I was very interested, I still am interested in transitional justice, and I'm interested in what happens to people who are left behind after war crimes, what happens to the survivors of war, and how can power relations be shifted in order to give every single person a chance at a life of dignity and also a chance at justice. I think that the real impetus for a law degree for me was I thought maybe I would become a criminal lawyer. I think that was the area of law that I was most interested in. It made sense because some of the writing and research that I had done had been around issues of transitional justice. It just so happened that in the first year of my studies, I became introduced to refugee law. And that's an area of law that intersects so closely, right? So closely with the world of international criminal law, because refugee law is one of those mechanisms that exists to give safe harbor to people fleeing war. And fundamentally, I'm more interested in what happens to those who survive war as opposed to those who perpetrate it. That was something I didn't expect.
But then it intersects in one way with your work previously. And as we are having this discussion today about women and how they are branded invisible within the law. So just to give some statistical background, so globally, women make up over 30% of asylum claimants worldwide. In some countries, the numbers are over 50%. Yet, similarly to the political discourses following the power relations within society, women are rendered invisible and remain mostly absent from the legal discourse. How are women erased in the system of law? If you had to explain it to someone who has no legal knowledge, how would you explain it?
So the thing that is insidious about this is that the erasure of gendered experiences, frankly, I think it happens on a subconscious level. Very few people are outwardly and explicitly misogynistic, and very few people think that they are sexist or misogynistic. What you see is not refugee lawyers and refugee decision makers who will make statements like women lie, women are not telling the truth. No one will make that statement publicly, but instead, you can see the impact of a subconscious kind of bias, which of course it is sexism, it is misogyny, and it's so hard to point it out when it's happening because it happens in a way that is very subtle and very quiet. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by it is subtle and quiet? I think a good example is what I have seen happen in refugee claims involving families. Actually, I've seen this again and again in family claims. Every claim is an individual claim. What does that mean in the context of a traditional nuclear family where we're presuming there's a husband, a wife, and children? What I see happen is women's stories are either absent or they are carbon copies of their husband's narratives. And the question that you might ask is, how is that possible? How is that possible? Because if every claim is an individual claim, surely a husband is filling out his own refugee forms and explaining the basis of his refugee claim. A wife is filling out her refugee forms and is explaining the basis of her refugee claim. If they are unrepresented, one might make the assumption that the family itself or whoever it is that's helping them informally thinks that the man's story is the important story. Because in many places, including in Kosovo, men act as representatives of the family. They are the face of the family to the public, and public events happen to them. Public events happen to the men in the family, not the women in the family. I can understand for a family that's unrepresented, that might make sense. Legally, it's not a great strategy, but I can understand why the presumption would be the man who is out in public and having events happen to him in public, that is the star of the show, and that is the story that really matters. I can understand that. What I find to be a subtle and quiet form of sexism is when this family is represented by a lawyer, and a lawyer goes through an entire refugee claim without asking the wife, who is also a claimant, what do they fear and what did they experience? What that looks like very practically is, imagine a lawyer that calls in this theoretical refugee family to write down what happened to them. And imagine that you have this theoretical husband and wife sitting in an office, and the only person who's being asked questions is the husband, because the husband is the only person who was arrested, or the husband is the only person who attended a protest, or the husband is the only person who was beaten up by skinheads, what have you. And without even saying it, by not asking her anything, she's not part of the story. Or if she is part of the story, her role is a supporting role where she is echoing what is already disclosed in her husband's claim. And no real investigation is done to find out, is there more to this? And obviously, this is a problem. First, it's a problem because the refugee decision maker, they are only going to consider the facts that are put in front of them. If the facts are not put in front of them, it is the same as them not existing. And second, if you are represented at a refugee hearing, there will be an assumption that you are represented and the person representing you will act in your best interest, including in deciding whether you will testify and to what extent. Here's a really concrete example. In the first year of my refugee practice, I was able to see lots of refugee claims prepared by other lawyers. And it was part of the learning experience for me to look at how are other lawyers conducting their refugee claims. And one particular claim that sticks in my mind because of how egregious the erasure was. It involved a case where there was police brutality on the basis of ethnicity. And even though it's true, the husband was the one who was roughed up by police, kidnapped by police, threatened by police, the wife was raped on one incident by police. And to the lawyer's credit, that incident of rape did make it onto the paper, right, in the file itself. But at the hearing, which lasted 3 hours, no one, and by that I mean not the lawyer and not the refugee decision maker, no one turned to the spouse to ask her, what happened? What do you fear? What happened was a hearing went by for 3 hours, and in the last 10 minutes of that hearing, the people in the room remember that she is there too and turn to her and ask her, do you have anything to add? And at that point, even if she wanted to add something, story of rape is not something that you skim through in the last 10 minutes of a hearing. And she very reasonably said, my husband covered everything.
Of course, it seems almost intentional.
You would think so, but I really don't think it is. I really don't think it is intentional. I think that it is so ingrained in our culture that a woman's story not be as important report as the story of the man in the room. It doesn't occur to anyone in that room to turn to her and ask her, what about you? And I think especially I'm speaking from a North American context. When you add the layers of race and class to this, it is all that much easier to pretend like that person is not there or to forget that that person is there. So by the way, this for sure is, in my view, this for sure is negligent. It's negligent on the part of the lawyer in the room whose job it is to get the testimony onto the record. And it's negligent on the part of that refugee decision maker who has two people sitting in front of them, two separate human beings in front of them with two separate worlds and two separate experiences. So it's negligent on two levels, professionally speaking. But ethically and politically, what's happening there? What's happening there is erasure. And the thing that is frightening about it to me is that I actually don't think it's malicious. I actually think it comes from a very primal place of disregard.
So what you're saying is something that Hannah Arendt would call the banality of evil, which is just following the system because it works in a certain way without reflecting on it on a deeper basis and how personal bias or societal bias colors in. This relates to lack of legal knowledge. So how does this lack of legal knowledge impact the refugee journey? Can you give us a little bit more insight?
I think that refugee claimants are uniquely vulnerable. First and foremost, because every refugee claimant is fleeing for their lives. And one cannot think strategically when in a state of fear. The problem with most refugee determination systems is that they are set up like a criminal trial in reverse, where the victim is responsible for putting forward the evidence and putting forward the facts. But the victim in a refugee claim doesn't have access to a police force that can go out and gather evidence and reports for them. The victim doesn't have an army of state prosecutors building arguments for them. For the most part, refugee claimants are alone when navigating this system. And something about the way that the refugee system, at least the way it's set up in Canada, setting it up to be like a small trial is a problem because it's assuming that there's access to evidence, access to good legal representation, access to great psychological supports, access to housing, access to work, right? Like the problem with this system is that it's presuming that there's a level playing field for everyone who comes before the tribunal. And we know that that is simply not true. The added layer to this is the fact that refugee claimants are not experts in refugee law, nor should they be. In the Canadian context, there's a wide range in terms of the quality of representation that you can get. And you would have no way of knowing how to differentiate between a bad refugee lawyer and a good refugee lawyer. What I mean by that is my license and the license of someone who spends 5 minutes with a client to fill out their forms and then throws it before the Immigration and Refugee Board, our license is the same. To the eyes of anyone looking at us from a distance, we are precisely the same. In practice, of course, we know that there are refugee lawyers who run what are called refugee claim mills, meaning there is no refugee claim that they will refuse, meaning that they're cranking out refugee files at a rate that is unsustainable, and it's impossible to ensure that the truth of the experiences of those claimants is shining through those files. It's just not possible. So refugee law has become so professionalized that it is impossible to be a self-represented refugee claimant unless you want to take the time to study refugee law, which frankly should not be a requirement to have your rights under the Refugee Convention respected. But I think that there is politically such a concern about fake refugees, and I'm using quotation marks, fake refugees in quotation marks versus real refugees, that there's been a political decision made to turn the refugee determination process into a process of small trials. And I think that is so far removed from the actual intention of the convention.
Anilo
to go back to the point you mentioned previously. Women are just erased. But what struck me when we spoke before and now, if they claim asylum on a rape claim, or let's say an LGBT plus case, the law doesn't recognize it as strong.
Well, the law will recognize the facts that are put in front of it. And what I mean by that is it's true. The Refugee Convention doesn't recognize gender as a standalone ground or sexual identity or sexual orientation as a standalone ground. We collapse those types of claims into particular social groups. So the convention recognizes that there are groups of people with innate characteristics, such as women, such as LGBTQ folk, and that the ground of their claim is membership in that particular social group. That's how the law has been used in order to recognize those types of refugee claims. The problem is that the success of a claim on the basis of, let's say, gender-based violence, from my point of view, is entirely dependent on the strength of the lawyer putting forward that claim. And that's a problem for obvious reasons, because you might have a very legitimate gender-based violence refugee claim. And if your individual lawyer does not know how to elicit those facts and how to present them, the claim will fail. Or if you don't have a lawyer who knows how to recognize that that is the basis for a refugee claim. I mean, I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen. And this is drawing from a personal example of a case of mine, and I'll be cautious with the amount of detail I provide. But I represented a woman who came to me after a series of refused refugee decisions, failure at the hearing, failure on appeal, failure on further appeal, and I'm coming at the tail end of a trail of negative decisions. And when I looked at the claim, I could understand why the refusals happened. The refugee claim made no sense. The narrative sounded, frankly, it sounded false because it didn't make sense, because there were so many internal inconsistencies in the narrative that she stuck to all throughout her refugee process. By the time she comes to me, she says, actually, the real reason why I came here is because the husband that I married 40 years ago, it was against my will. It was a forced marriage. And actually, he raped me and I was forced to marry him. And that completely changes the nature of the claim, because what's being told to me now is a story of a woman being raped, forced to marry her abuser, and then lives in a very private hell for the next 40 years, involving some of the most extreme intimate partner violence that you can imagine. And somehow this woman was resourceful enough and resilient enough to figure out a way to get herself here with some of her children. And when she came to Canada, she approached someone from her own community to ask for advice on how to tackle her refugee claim, told her lawyer the same story that I'm telling you. And her lawyer responded with, this isn't a strong refugee claim because you stayed with him for so long. This isn't a strong refugee claim because you have no witnesses who can bolster what you're saying, and you never went to the police. So all you have is your word and the word of your kids, who of course will back up what you're saying. Your refugee claim would be much stronger if it was on the basis of your nationality, because she comes from a multi-ethnic country where there is inter-ethnic conflict. And Rina, that's the definition of sexism and misogyny.
And also racism.
And also racism, yes.
Because you can see how the political interjects in the law. And, as you're just like, especially the part when you mention you're coming from this country with this composition, societal composition, how do you think this plays out in the greater scheme? And how does this make up for a repressive immigration regime, or can be used as an argument to move to that?
So I don't know if this is going to the heart of your question, but refugee law very often comes down to who is believed, who is trustworthy, and who we trust versus who we do not trust. That's not an objective question, that's a subjective question. We will answer that question based on our social position. So who is more likely to be believed in a case of gender-based violence it's a question of class, and it's a question of race, and it's a question of orientation, we will answer that question based on who we are, not based on whatever objective truth exists out there in the world. We answer that question based on who we are. And in Canada, the conversation about refugee claims is almost derogatory at times because there is a belief that there are bogus refugees and real refugees. And combine that with racism and classism, combine that also with the real misunderstanding about what gendered violence looks like. The end result is going to be a system that's really about punishment on the basis of wasting resources that are not supposed to belong to you. They're supposed to belong to us, they're not supposed to belong to you. There's a belief in Canada that if you have gone through the refugee system and you've received a negative decision, it means that everything that you have said about yourself is false, that your intention for being here is to exploit this very compassionate country and its resources. And the feeling in response to failed refugee claimants, the feeling is often one of punishment. That's the real impetus for deportation, frankly. Of course, deportation is embedded in our immigration laws. The idea is that surely we must have some kind of system for keeping people in and keeping people out in order for this country to be secure, in order for its resources to be protected, in order for this place not to be exploited. But at its core, it's really a form of punishment. That's what I see. And really, the question of belief, it seems like it's a legal question, but it's really a political question.
And you mentioned punishment several times in this conversation. And what we don't see beyond the court of law is how these women then are punished in the longer term. Because if you're saying women are erased within the system, this has real material consequences for them in the country they arrive. Because whether they are a single mother, and as in the case you just mentioned, or whether they are the husbands, who then, I'm not saying it's by default so, but women experience gender-based violence within their household. Within the law, they remain invisible, and this invisibility then impacts their journey in this new country and renders them dependent by default.
I think that one can see that in terms of what kind of refugee claims come forward from female claimants. In this country, about 1 in 6 of refugee claims made by women are on the basis of gender-based violence, either violence that they experienced back home on the intimate partner violence, or violence that is directed towards women on a more systemic level. So I'm thinking of gender apartheid. The long-term implication for a woman like the one that I gave the example of, who told her story of intimate partner violence and was told this isn't a good basis for a refugee claim, the long-term implication for her is that when she does finally tell the truth of her experiences, the assumption is that this is a new story. This is a new story that's been cooked up in order to find a way to remain in the country. And once there has been a negative credibility finding, once one tribunal has said that you don't tell the truth, you're not credible, it is extremely difficult to overcome it on appeal. It's extremely difficult to say after a few refusals that actually I was given the wrong advice from the very beginning because I trusted someone to have the expertise to guide me through this process. And here is the actual basis for my fear that I would like you to consider. That is incredibly difficult to do. The long-term implication is being targeted for deportation, right back to the place where you fled from. It's a life or death implication, actually. And we've spoken a lot about gender-based violence that occurs within the context of the home, intimate partner violence. We haven't spoken about gender apartheid or violence against women that occurs at a statewide level. And the reason why I think it's important to bring that into this discussion is because there is a recognition that certain states are repressive towards women. I think it's fair to say that Canada understands that a state like Iran probably fits the bill as being a form of gender apartheid. Saudi Arabia probably fits the bill of being a gender apartheid. How are individual women meant to respond to systems of gender apartheid? I think that question is entirely shaped by myths around how women should respond to violence enacted upon them. And I think, again, this is a good place for an example. Our office represents someone who is an activist, and she's an activist in Iran who has political viewpoints that have been made very clear, and she has suffered tremendously for it. Some of those political beliefs, of course, revolve around the regime's treatment of women. She was initially granted refugee protection by Canada. About 10 years after granting her refugee protection, the government of Canada initiated proceedings to take that status away from her. Why? Because she continued traveling back to Iran, and she continued traveling back to Iran because her sister was arrested. Her mother was harassed. This is a family of women that produces anti-regime films that specifically speak to the lived experiences of women in Iran. And our client continued going back out of a sense of duty towards her family, yes, but also out of a sense of political activism. That despite the risks to herself, she will continue to go back because it's not enough for her as a singular woman to be safe. She feels the impetus to continue to act politically against the regime. And the position of the government of Canada is that somebody who was truly afraid would not go back. And that actually she's returning to Iran because she is feeling safe there. And the long-term implication for her, right, because of this presumption of how women should or should not act, is that she will be stripped of this status and sent back to a place where she will continue being an activist, because that is not the type of political belief that you just drop the moment it becomes inconvenient. But what it means is that other women in her position may choose to abandon their politics completely, their feminist politics completely, rather than risk the loss of status. The implication in my world is always the risk of deportation back to a place of persecution. That is the primary consequence because the type of erasure we're talking about, it's not just deportation to a place that maybe you would prefer to be in, it's deportation to a place where there may be a real risk to one's life.
What you're saying is the law, in a way, is searching for the perfect victim. And similarly to the public discourse, who is eligible to stay and who is not. When I listen to you now and I read public discourse about immigration in the newspapers, they seem to almost go hand in hand on certain occasions. I don't want to totalize and say absolutely, but how do you think do these two segments, or the law and public discourses, on this occasion and beyond, influence each other?
Well, I think, again, the issue of who is to be believed and who isn't, of course, that's a political question. It's always a political question. And right now in this country, if you have a government that is announcing that immigration targets need to be lowered because immigrants are currently presenting a strain on this society, the message that people will absorb is that immigrants are a strain on this society. Refugees are a strain on this society. It's not that hard to then extrapolate that immigrants and refugees, they're actually responsible for the economic strains that Canada is experiencing, that actually refugees and immigrants, they're responsible for the lack of housing, for how expensive groceries are. They're responsible for the fact that the cost of living is so expensive here. Well, it's because we have so many people who come here and exploit this country's resources. And what does that mean for women who are newcomers? It means that all of a sudden, women who were called heroes for working as personal support workers in old people's homes, or who served food or delivered food, all of a sudden, they are the ones who are taking advantage of the generosity of this place. I don't think I can stress enough how much feminized labor in this country is entirely dependent on the labor of newcomer women. This is a society that really does not value caregiving work. And that's why so much caregiving work in this place is outsourced, right? Nannies are outsourced. People who care for the elderly, outsourced. And that's not an accident, right? It's not an accident. It simply is not a priority because that's women's work. That's women's work. And if women here don't want to do it, that's fine. We'll import women from elsewhere to do it. But when the public perception shifts in this way, those same women who we rely upon all of a sudden become demonized, even though they are here at our invitation. There's this perception, at least in Canada, that there's immigrants who came here the right way, and then there's fake refugees who are just lying through their teeth through the system. And the most common misconception is that these are two separate groups of people. Actually, they are one and the same. My refugee clients are the ones who start out by working on farms, picking vegetables, because no one in this country wants to do that work. They're the ones who are taking care of children so that Canadian women can go out and pursue their career goals. Or they are the ones who a bus from 2 hours from the suburbs where they're living out to some other corner of the city to take care of somebody's elderly parents. Those are who my clients are. The public perception that somehow there's the immigrants who do things the right way and contribute, and then there's refugees who are lying through their teeth and exploiting Canada for every benefit it can get. That is a fairy tale put forward by a strain of politics that would prefer that this country be primarily white and that would prefer that Canada has no obligations whatsoever under the Refugee Convention. So, yes, the political discourse absolutely impacts public perception and it absolutely impacts policy as well. Because without this story of exploitative newcomers, you would not have a drop in immigration targets. You simply wouldn't.
We explored the political and the legal, but we did not explore what happens to clients who you represent, but who do not live in Canada, and how these discourses impact them legally and politically. Do you have any experience in this regard? Do you represent someone who does not live in Canada per se?
I represent many people who do not live in Canada, and currently I represent a few people who are Palestinian and who are stuck in third countries. And by every definition, they are refugees. For someone like my Palestinian clients, particularly the ones who are women or girls, there is no place to return to. Particularly in the case of the Gaza Strip, there's nothing to return to. There's an inherent vulnerability in being a woman or a girl in a place under military occupation, like the Gaza Strip. In a third country, such as we're using the example of Egypt, there's the inherent vulnerability that comes with being a newcomer, yes. There's the vulnerability of being without status, yes. There's also the vulnerability of what it means to be a single woman with no form of family protection around you to navigate a society that is new to you. And then there's the additional layer of, for women who are displaced, who meet the criteria of being refugees, the pathway to Canada is not direct. Canada has a system for bringing refugees from third countries to Canada. It's called the refugee resettlement process, and it takes years for a refugee to be resettled from a third country to Canada. So what options do my clients have? Well, luckily, all of my clients have some kind of family connection to Canada, which means that they have people here who are willing to undertake to provide for all of their needs. And since the refugee resettlement process takes years, and it's simply not tenable to have my clients, some of whom are women and girls, waiting for years, we have to try this other approach, which is Canada has created a special pathway to give visitor visas to Palestinians from the Gaza Strip if they have family ties to Canada. So we're pushing for the equivalent of tourist visas. We have the option to try to apply for special permits where the Minister of Immigration says, okay, despite the fact that under normal circumstances, we would never give you a visa, we'll give you a special visa in this circumstance. And we're dancing around the fact that these are refugees. That's what we are doing. And in the case of Palestinian women and girls in particular, there is no special understanding in the public discourse of Canada that what Palestinian women and girls are experiencing is a unique form of victimization that is happening to them as women. I think that's been lost. And of course, I think that's based in Islamophobia and in anti-Palestinian racism. I can't think of another reason to move so slowly on visas and permits for this group of people compared to other groups of people. And there is no Palestinian girl or woman that I have spoken to in the Gaza Strip who has not experienced some form of humiliation or degradation, not just on the basis of her gender, not just on the basis of her ethnicity, but on the basis of both her gender and her ethnicity. I feel like for Yazidi women, there was a special understanding of their victimization on the basis of both gender and sex. I think we saw that level of understanding for Bosnian women. I don't see that same level of understanding for Palestinian. I don't think we will come to know the full extent of what Palestinian women and girls have experienced in particular until after the end of this war. When I speak to Palestinian women and girls, I can't help but think about members of my own family and members of my own community. And I can't help but think about stories that I heard from women and girls in particular that only came out well after, long after the dust settled.
When you are from Kosovo and have that experience, you well understand the different layers, and being this person with this experience, it's impossible to escape it. It's impossible to erase it from the conversation.
It's impossible to not see the connections. Of course, it's a different place. Of course, it's a different group of people. And what I'm doing is called transference. It's projecting things that are personal to me onto situations that do not belong to me. It's also the basis of compassion, I think.
I mean, this is the end of the conversation, but what I find fascinating in your work is how your experience in Kosovo, when you've written about women in Kosovo and your work in Canada intersect, and how for you there is a mission to protect women at every level, whether it is changing the public discourses via media, or now your work is changing or trying to work in a system that it's a hard surface to scratch against. And I think that is very inspiring, Hana.
This conversation has been quite grim. I don't think there's any way that it couldn't have been grim. But the real joy of this work is occasionally throwing a rock into the machine, watching it glitch and malfunction. That feels really good. And that's the part of this job that I really like.
You just spoke about Kosovo, and at the end of each conversation, there is one question I ask every guest. If there was one thing you could bring from Kosovo to Canada, what would it be?
Easy, my friends, hands down, my friends, and that fighting spirit that comes from being from Kosovo. So, two things.
That's a beautiful ending to this conversation. Thanks so much, Hana, for being here today.
Rina, I wish I could have spent more time with you, and hopefully the next time we speak, it'll be about lighter topics.
Thank you.